day. In another module, we talked about the problem of dimensions. Dimensions are distinguished from units in that dimensions simply refer to things that you can measure, quantities like length, mass, time, and so forth. But of course, simply saying that a length or a mass exists doesn't really get you very far. One thing you need to do is to be able to quantify how much of a length or a mass or a time that you're dealing with. And so when you engage in scientific work, you have to be able to measure something in quantifiable units. That is, you have to have some relationship between the quantity of a length or a mass and some number. And the factor that is used to quantify quantity of length, mass, or time, or any of the other dimensions is referred to as a unit. Now, units have an interesting history to them. Ever since human beings have had commerce, there's been the issue of being able to measure things. If I'm a land seller, for example, and I want to sell you an acre of land for so much, you have to have a reliable way of being able to measure an acre of land. Now, the traditional way of measuring an acre of land is to quantify it as the area of land that a team of oxen can plow in one day. All right, now if I'm an unscrupulous land dealer and I say that I've got this acre of land and I'll let you measure it, I'll even provide the oxen for you, I could very easily cheat you by providing a team of tired oxen that wouldn't plow as much ground as say, a well-rested team of oxen could. So, there's this necessity that grew up out of the need for reliable commerce to be able to reliably measure things, to be able to reliably quantify things. And what I'd like to do is to just take you through a little bit of the traditional history of units, and in another module we'll talk about the way in which systems of units have been standardized in modern science. All right, now let's take a very simple unit that we're all familiar with. Let's take the unit of the inch, which is a unit of the dimension of length. This has a kind of an interesting history to it. The word inch has two derivations. One is from the Anglo-Saxon, which is Y-N-C-A, inche, and that means thumb. That's the Anglo-Saxon word for thumb. In Latin, the inch has its derivation in the word uncia, and uncia means 12th part. It's an entirely different language, an entirely different tradition of measuring things. Now, the reason the Anglo-Saxons referred to an inche is that they used their thumbs as units of measurement. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my thumb, I'm going to zoom in here with the screen right here, and I'm going to say, I'm going to try and trace out my thumb right here. Okay, so there's my thumb. And the Anglo-Saxon inche refers to, until it comes back, the width of the thumb. That's why the word inche means thumb, and where this unit of measurement comes from. And the idea is that the width of a thumb is equal to 1 inch. Now, if we take a ruler and we come along and look at this, we see that it's not too bad. It's very close to 1 inch, and this was used as a fundamental measure of length in Anglo-Saxon times. Now, of course, some people are bigger than others. Some people have wider thumbs than others, and so the same problem exists in standardizing the inch so that you don't run into the tired oxen problem. And so what the Anglo-Saxons did was they standardized an inch as the width of 3 barley corns. The idea here is that you take something that's less variable than the thumb and you use that as your standard. And I've taken 3 barley corns. Those basically refer to kernels of corn, and we've lined them up next to one another, and you can see that it comes pretty close, and so that's the origin of the inch. With the Latin, the inch is the 12th part of what's called a foot, and in this instance, it was the old Latin term was the pes naturalis, which is the length of 1 foot. Now, that's not quite 12 inches, as our modern definition of foot would indicate, but it's actually closer to about 10 inches or so. But the Latins used the word uncia to describe the 12th part of a foot. Now, this is just an illustration of the fact that units have a long history in lots of different cultures, because different cultures grow up in different traditions of commerce and markets and those kinds of things. You have a plethora of different kinds of units out there. We've seen one example here. Anglo-Saxons will define an inch in one way, and Romans would define an inch in another way. And if you're going to avoid chaos, if you're going to have trades between these two different kinds of cultures, then you need to be able to have some kind of a standard. And so this has led to the formulation, actually beginning in medieval Europe, of a system of so-called customary units. And customary units are simply agreed upon standards that everyone will agree to. Now, the history of English units is especially interesting in this regard because, of course, one of the things that happened in England was that a primarily Anglo-Saxon culture, which had one way of measuring things, was invaded by a primarily Roman culture during the Norman conquest, and this led to all kinds of interesting conflicts over ways that you measure things. And one of the things that came out of the Norman conquest was the reconciliation of these very different systems of units. So, for example, if you talk about some other units of measurement, one of the units of measurement that we use for length, for example, is the yard. And the yard we currently define as 36 inches. We have other means of standardizing the inch, of course, but back in the olden days, during Norman conquest times, this wasn't there was no really agreed upon standard. So everyone needed to have some standard that they would agree to. And after the Norman conquest, for example, they defined the yard as the distance between the tip of your finger out here, in this case my right hand, and the tip of the nose. And the standard they agreed on was a distance for King Henry I. And I'm a big guy, and the distance between the nose and the tip of my finger in this case is about 39 inches, but apparently old Henry I was shorter, and so his came very much closer to the 36-inch yard that we are familiar with. Same thing with the concept of the fathom. The fathom is used as a unit of nautical measure, and this was measured with plumbing rope. And so sailors, in paying out lengths of rope, would basically pay out a length of rope between the two ends of their outstretched arms, and that corresponds to the definition of the fathom. And the fathom is 6 feet, and my fathom comes out to be a little bit shorter than that. 69 inches is where my finger ended up with, a little bit shorter than the 72 inches that is the formal definition of the fathom. And so these initial ways of measuring length, even though they were standardized to one person's particular body dimensions, that was a standard that had to be either made permanent somehow, or some kind of, or otherwise you would have chaos resulting when different kings of different statures would come into play. And so you find various ways of trying to standardize these things. For example, there was a difficulty in standardizing the Anglo-Saxon definition of a foot from the Roman definition of a foot. And so what everyone agreed upon was to lay out a line at one of the pillars at the base of St. Paul's Cathedral that everyone would agree was the standard foot. And so in this way, customary units, systems of customary units built upon these kind of ad hoc needs for standardization and generalization. Now, Despite all these efforts at standardization, still it was very, very difficult to be able to standardize weights and measures. And again, the role of commerce and trade between different cultures plays a very important role in this. For example, let's look at the measurements of volume. The gallon in the English system is the principal means of measuring volume. That's one of the primary units. And the trouble is that gallons are defined differently based upon what particular cultures are trying to sell or not. For example, you have a dry gallon, which consists of, is defined as 8 pounds of wheat barley corns, and that was the measure of volume that was favored by people who tried to sell and buy grain. On the other hand, you have gallons that were defined for ale, or different gallons that were defined for wine, or those sorts of things. And to make matters worse, Roman tradition had a different definition of gallons than English measurements did. And we can go on and on about the similar kinds of problems that exist for weights as well. Finally, one interesting phenomenon that explains a lot of the units is that when you have a unit of measure, you have to have some way of quantifying multiples of that unit. And so, for example, in the English system, you have 12 inches making up one larger unit of length, the foot, and you have 3 feet making up a larger unit of measure, the yard. And if you notice, those particular measurements are based upon numbers that can be divided by 3. And again, we come back to our Anglo-Saxon definition of the inch based upon the width of 3 barley corns. The tendency of English units to come in multiples of 3, like for example 12 inches 4 times 3 to the foot, or 3 feet to the yard, and those sorts of things. Those derive from this fundamental reliance on units of 3 to be able to measure things. On the other hand, the Romans tended to like to divide the world up into multiples of 5 and multiples of 10. And so, for example, the Roman mile comes from the Roman abbreviation for 1,000. Romans defined a mile as the length that you could cover with 1,000 strides. And of course, this was useful for quantifying measurements of troops and those sorts of things which the Romans tried to do. And so if you look at the Roman types of units, you find that they tend to be divided into multiples of 5 and multiples of 10. And of course, this corresponds very nicely to the system of Roman units, which has different symbols for 1s, 5s, 10s, 50s, and so forth. Now, obviously, as fascinating as this is as history, it nevertheless is extremely confusing and very hard to quantify things in a standard way. We can define units of volume as the gallon, we can have a particular standard measure, but we still cannot escape this cultural influence on our units. For example, in Canada, back when before they were a metric country, they would sell their liquids in units of imperial gallons. We, on the other hand, sell our liquids in the form of American gallons, and those two are measured different quantities of things. So even with all the attempts at standardization, the influence of culture is very, very strong and is carried over in our units and makes units very, very hard to deal with. And in another module, what we'll talk about is the system of units that scientists have developed to not only standardize the measurement of different kinds of dimensions, but also to make the conversion of measurements from one type of unit to another very, very simple.